As I've discussed previously, the way I structure this class is to show how historiography is essentially a centuries-long conversation among historians from different eras. Now, oftentimes what we've seen in this class is, as part of this conversation, it is often a refutation of previous schools of thought. We saw this clearly last week when we talked about the consensus historians, which I described as sort of a counter-progressive group of historians. They were against Charles Beard and the progressive historians of the early 20th century. We're going to pick up on a similar theme this week, and that is this idea of radical history as a counter to the consensus history that reigned in the historical profession in the 1940s, 1950s, and even into the early 1960s. Because what we are going to see is as the nation itself came unglued in the 1960s. I'm sure some of you have taken history classes in the past and you've learned about the tumultuous 1960s, where you have the civil rights, the anti-war, the women's movements, all these different forms of activism taking place. We see a similar dynamic taking place within the historical profession itself, as a lot of these activists are protesting on the university campuses. They're not only fighting for, again, the end to the Vietnam War, civil rights, women's rights, so on and so forth, but they are actually fighting for a different kind of history as well. One that is more inclusive, one that includes some of the groups that they are fighting along with out on the streets, whether that be African Americans, whether that be workers, whether that be women, and this will lead to the introduction of what is known as history from the bottom up or history from below. Now again, talking about how this class is structured, we've sort of already touched on this fact. If you remember back some time ago in the semester, we talked about E.P. Thompson, and he introduced, in fact, from the European side of this story, history from below in his discussion of the working class. Well, today we're going to look at history from below as it developed on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, across the pond, if you will, here in the United States. Before I talk about this radical history and the birth of it, I want to discuss briefly here what it was like to be a university student in the 1950s. So just to give you a little bit of very, very basic background here, after World War II, we would see an explosion in the admissions into college. And one of the leading reasons for this, of course, was the GI Bill, where you have a lot of returning veterans after World War II would come home and be able to enter college free. So this greatly increased the amount of people on college campuses. But what we are going to see in this era is, just like consensus history, you are going to see sort of a conservative university. You are going to see sororities and fraternities being the big events on campus. Panty raids was the big thing, where the fraternities go into the sorority and go ruffle through the clothing of the women. And that's about as extreme as it gets. And we are going to see a similar dynamic in the sort of thinking that is going on at these same college campuses. Now, a lot of this has to do with the atmosphere that is the 1950s. And when we're talking about the atmosphere of this era, you, of course, are alluding to McCarthyism, the fear of communism, which seeps into, of course, universities. And we are going to see, really, in fact, with the rise of McCarthyism in the 1950s, radicalism on college campuses all but disappeared after being very prominent in the 1930s. For instance, in California in 1952, 28 private and public colleges and universities collaborated with the state legislature's Committee on Un-American Activities. And this was sort of the state version of the House Un-American Activities Committee, also known as HUAC, which hunted communists, whether it's at the national scene or more locally at the state level. So nonetheless, what we would see is when these public colleges and universities collaborated with this state legislature's Committee on Un-American Activities, we would see the installation on each of these campuses an official that kept a watchful eye on professors who either criticized HUAC itself or failed to criticize the Soviet Union strong enough. Outside of California, we would see a similar dynamic unfolding on college campuses. In fact, one of the individuals that was caught in this HUAC dragnet, this anti-communist dragnet, if you will, was a historian that we've talked about previously, and that was William Appleman Williams. If you remember when we were talking about Frederick Jackson Turner, William Appleman Williams would use his Turner thesis to argue that the United States had been an imperialist nation throughout its history. So obviously, you can understand how this historian who's calling the United States an imperialist power, when government officials in the United States are claiming that the United States is the beacon of freedom and liberty against the savage Soviet Union, why William Appleman Williams would be targeted. But nonetheless, what did this targeting actually look like? Well, for 5 years, from 1952 until 1957, William Appleman Williams, after earning his PhD, as we talked about previously, at the University of Wisconsin, he would teach at the University of Oregon. And it was there that he later explained, quote, various people there tried to make life miserable for me and some other people on the campus. They got rid of at least 3 of us. In short, this threat of termination of employment, if you are speaking out against U.S. actions, whether at home or abroad, your job is going to be at stake possibly. And that was the kind of pressure that William Appleman Williams was facing at the University of Oregon. But we would also see this dynamic play out in other forums for William Appleman Williams as well. After he left the University of Oregon in 1957, he would actually return to the university where he obtained his PhD, which again was the University of Wisconsin. And he was in the process 2 years later of submitting the final manuscript for his book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. And this was supposed to go to a publisher by the name of George Braziller. And as the book was given to the publisher, the publishing house refused to publish it. It was too inflammatory. Again, this was the idea that American diplomacy was premised on this idea of imperialism. So now, all of a sudden, William Appleman Williams cannot publish this book because the publishing house will not do it. Well, interestingly enough, the following year, when Williams' next book, The Contours of American History, was about to go into galleys in preparation for publication the following year, the manuscript was actually subpoenaed by the National House Un-American Activities Committee. So here we see again further efforts to silence this critic of the American government, William Appleman Williams, whether it's done by a publisher or whether it's done here with the Contours of American History by the actual government, the House Un-American Activities Committee. So in short, during this period in the 1950s, historians who refused to join their fellow consensus historians in celebrating the American past faced much repression in the 1950s and the early 1960s. And we can see that here, even in the stuff, in the material that people are reading. Just to finish up in this slide, this magazine cover to the left actually comes from the American Legion magazine. This is from November of 1951. Now, the American Legion was sort of a lobbying group for returning veterans from World War II. It was quite conservative and it was quite anti-communist during this early years of the Cold War. In fact, for all of the Cold War, it was very anti-communist. But as you can see on the front page here, the cover, the top story, do colleges have to hire red professors? Basically putting forth this notion that college professors are all communists and they have to be dangerous. As you can see below that, parents can rid campuses of communists who cloak themselves in academic freedom. So this idea is, again, if you even look closer on this image here, in the background on the chalkboard, imperialism is mentioned. So these are the kind of ideas that are swirling around, and it really is stultifying. It really restricts what historians can actually say. William Appleman Williams being the case in point, as we talked about the struggles that he faced to get his work published. What I'd like to turn our attention to now is the birth of radical history. And just like the radical historians themselves, who sort of have one foot in academia, on the campus, in the lecture halls, and another foot actually on the streets participating in the protest movements, we see radical history itself forming both in the university, on campus, and also off campus on the streets among activists. So we're going to continue our discussion here of William Appleman Williams, who I would describe as sort of the godfather of radical history. And the reason I say this is because when he joins the University of Wisconsin History Department in 1957, he will train a series of very prominent future radical historians. And what we are going to see is his graduate seminars created an intellectual environment for radical history to flourish during this time. The students who participated in these seminars wrote papers that eventually were turned into dissertations for their PhD, and then ultimately books that challenged the consensus history that we talked about in the previous week's lecture. Well, in 1959, these students went from the seminar room to create their own academic journal, and this was known as Studies on the Left. Its editors over the next 8 years included many of William Appleman Williams' students, including Martin Schuyler, Lloyd Gardner, James Weinstein, and Stoughton Lynd, all of whom later became leading forces behind radical history. So if you're looking for talking about the final project for different historians who are involved in radical history, any of those individuals that I just mentioned would be prominent among that group. But nonetheless, what we are going to see is in this journal's first editorial, the editors did an excellent job of explaining what they were attempting to do with this new periodical. This editorial that I just referred to said the following. This comes from the editors. Quote, as graduate students anticipating academic careers, we feel a very personal stake in academic life, and we feel that, as radicals, we are hampered in our work by the intrusion of prevailing standards of scholarship. So here are these young graduate students, groomed by William Appleman Williams in this theory of radical history, and they are very clear that they are radicals, but yet that university that they are being brought up in and trained in is still so stultifying here in the early 1960s that it hampers their work because, again, the prevailing standards of scholarship, that's that consensus history that I was talking about. That's what they have to overcome here. And they're hoping that this journal, along with their other writings in the seminar rooms, will help change this prevailing standard of scholarship. Nonetheless, we also see a growing interest in radical history outside of the university's walls. And what we are going to see is one group in particular will lead the charge, and that was Students for Democratic Society, SDS. This was the organization, the student organization of the 1960s. They were involved with community organizing. They were involved with civil rights activism, and they would eventually become involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. But nonetheless, they were definitely the leading anti-student activist organization in the 1960s. Well, in December of 1965, SDS would start what was known as the Radical Education Project, Radical Education Product, or REP. Now, the main reason that that SDS created REP was due to a growing concern among SDS leaders, many of them, in fact, nearly all of them, university students themselves, primarily from the University of Michigan. They were worried that, for the most part, the activists and members that were part of SDS were more interested in action than in ideas. And these academics themselves, these academic leaders of SDS, they wanted activists to have a mix, not only be concerned about protests and activism on the streets, but also the ideas undergirding these actions. So as a result, it stated in its initial publication in December of 1965 that its purpose was to act as a, quote, an independent educational research and publication program initiated by Students for a Democratic Society, dedicated to the cause of a democratic radicalism and aspiring to the creation of a new left in America. So here we see an effort to again use education to teach movement activists useful lessons from the past. To this end, we are going to see the Radical Education Project talk about a need to investigate abolitionism, the mid-19th century movement that sought to abolish slavery. Also the Russian Revolution, to see how any of its aspects could be applicable here in the United States. And finally, the British Labour Party, which was one of the more leftist political parties in Great Britain. So again, Radical Education Project going to look at these topics, teach the movement activists. Hopefully that will help instruct their activism on the streets. By the end of the decade, what we are going to find is that radical historians are going to confront the establishment, if you will. Those consensus historians that are still in the leadership roles in American history, whether in colleges or in historical organizations. And this comes to a head on December 28th of 1969 during the American Historical Association, the AHA's annual convention or annual meeting, which was meeting that year at the Sheraton Park Hotel in Washington, D.C. This was the meeting. I've talked about the American Historical Organization Association in the past. They were the main historical organization in all of the United States going back to the late 19th century. So this is where all the bigwigs met and gave papers, presented their research, so on and so forth. But this time in 1969, we are going to see a radical caucus that was led by people like Howard Zinn, who we're going to talk about next week, Staughton Lynd, Jesse Lemisch, two individuals that we see referred to, and one of them actually in one of the writings, or completed one of the writings for this week's readings, and then also Arthur Waskow. And these radical caucus members, along with others left unnamed here, would go against the historical establishment. And in particular, these individuals that I just named, they would actually hold a panel at this conference, a historical panel titled, "What is Radical History?" And it was in this panel, or during this panel, that Jesse Lemisch would present a paper on, quote, "Present-mindedness revisited, anti-radicalism as a goal of American historical writing since World War II." In essence, this is about consensus history. That's what this paper is that Jesse Lemisch is giving here in December of 1969. Well, in it, Lemisch defended radical history, not surprising, and he did so by arguing that radical historians injected politics into their writing. Yes, he did not attempt to hide that or cover it up. But here's the thing. He said radical historians did this. They injected politics into their writing no more than other historians. Other historians, their politics was conservatism. That's what consensus historians were all about. Jesse Lemisch said radical historians are different. They put more of a kind of leftist politics into their history, but nonetheless, again, they're no different than what other historians are doing. He also claimed that there was in fact no such thing as objectivity and political neutrality in historical writing. Thus, he described the task of radical historians in the following way, and this is a quote that we see on the screen, quote, "And we are in the libraries, writing history, trying to cure it of your partisan and self-congratulatory fictions, trying to come to a little closer to finding out how things actually were." Here again is a direct jab at those consensus historians who are writing about a united historical past in the United States, what Lemisch here describes as, quote, "self-congratulatory fictions," and what he described the radical historians were doing was trying to provide an actual truth of what history was really like. And how are you going to do that? By digging up these untold stories from women, minority groups, workers, so on and so forth. Well, in addition to this radical caucus, and in addition to this panel, What is Radical History?, we would also see the radical caucus come face to face with the establishment at the annual business meeting that was held every year along with the AHA conference. Now, this meeting was usually boring. About 100 people attended most of the previous business meetings. But in 1969, the room was packed. In fact, it was an overflowing room with over 2,000 participants. And as part of this business meeting, which explains why it was so populated, radical historians had nominated the individual that we see on the left there, Staughton Lynd, for president of the AHA, a radical historian for president. And additionally, these radical historians in the Radical Caucus also put forward an anti-war resolution against the Vietnam War for the AHA to adopt, to publicly explain its opposition to the Vietnam War. Well, not surprisingly, the Vietnam resolution was defeated, but the vote was actually quite close, 647 to 611 defeat. Now, interestingly enough, Eugene Genovese, who we're reading for this week, he criticizes Staughton Lynd's writing in the document for this week. Eugene Genovese was a well-known Marxist historian, so he was on the left end of the political spectrum. And his path-breaking work on slavery had brought him much acclaim outside of this kind of radical history milieu. And he really believed that change was necessary, so he agreed with the radical historians in that regard, but he wanted to work through the system, if you will, through the proper channels. And he believed that these radical historians were not doing that. So therefore, when there was discussion about this amendment or this resolution to promote an anti-Vietnam perspective by the AHA, Eugene Genovese supposedly said the following, quote, "Put them down," in reference to the radical historians, put them down hard, once and for all. Like the Vietnam Resolution, Lin's candidacy also came to naught. He was defeated by a very establishment historian from Yale University, a guy by the name of R.R. Palmer. So nonetheless, we see here two defeats for radical historians, but it is worth noting, for the first time in its 85-year history, an opposition candidate was put on the platform for the AHA president, which was unheard of. So it does show you that radical historians had arrived on the scene. Even if they didn't win, they had definitely arrived on the scene. I'd like to end this lecture by talking about one of the authors of the primary text that you're reading for this week, and that is Jesse Lemisch. So in February of 1966, the Radical Education Project out of SDS put out its first essay, which was Jesse Lemisch's Towards a Democratic History. Now, interestingly enough, it is well known today and very prominent some, 60 years later, right? Yeah, about 60 years later, 58 years later. But at the time, Radical Education Project published just 20,000 copies, and it's actually sold extremely poorly. So you can see there's still difficulty of getting these ideas out there. But nonetheless, who was this guy, Jesse Lemisch? Well, Lemisch had actually earned both his undergraduate and PhD from Yale University. After finishing his dissertation in 1963, he joined another prestigious university, the University of Chicago, where he would remain until 1968, after which he was essentially fired. Now, one of the reasons why he was let go and his contract was not renewed was because during his time at Chicago, Lemisch became involved in various anti-war, university, and civil rights protests. Such activism undoubtedly played a role in the University of Chicago's decision to cut him off and not offer him that continuation of his contract. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, Lemisch would sort of get the last laugh in, because we are going to see more than 30 years after his dissertation was accepted by Yale University, Lemisch finally published his book based on that dissertation, Jack Tar versus John Bull, The Role of New York Seamen in Precipitating the Revolution. This was published in 1997. Now, there had been articles previous to this, which again helped Lemisch really solidify his reputation as a historian from below by talking about these seamen and in helping bring forth the revolution in the late 1700s. But I bring it up here also because of the fact that though the book comes in at under 200 pages, it has 583 footnotes. This is meticulous. This is a lot of footnotes for a book of that size. So why do I bring that up? So what? That's what I have on the screen here, as you can see. Well, what this was meant to do was it showed that the extensive research conducted by Lemisch and also his effort to document his claims was significant because he was, when this was originally written back in the 1960s, he was countering the views that were written and prominent during the Cold War, which was a very conservative era. So in short, to ensure that this radical history would be accepted as truth, he needed to document that he found this information here, here, and here. Because if he didn't, people would just brush it off and say it's a bunch of fabricated stuff. It's not real. So by documenting it again, Jesse Lemisch here was trying to say, yes, this is radical history, but it is no less objective. It is no less truthful than what you're reading. It is based on as much factual information. So to, again, tie it into previous stuff that we talked about in this class, this is very Rankian, right? Remember, the scientific history of Ranke, one of the earliest historians that we talked about, the German historian, that's what we're essentially seeing here Lemisch doing in his Jack Tar versus John Bull. He is saying radical history can be Rankian, it can be scientific, it can use sources to make a different kind of history than what the consensus historians were producing in the 1940s and 1950s.